If your life has felt unusually heavy lately, if people have disappeared without explanation, if the things that used to bring you comfort suddenly feel hollow, Carl Jung believed this could mean something very specific. Not that you are broken, not that you are failing, but that something inside you is ending so that something else can begin. Most people, when they enter this kind of season, assume the worst. They assume they are falling apart. They assume they have lost themselves. But Jung spent his life studying exactly this experience, and what he found was almost the opposite of what it feels like from the inside. He found that the darkest periods of a person's life are often not a sign of collapse. They are a sign of construction. Something is being dismantled so that something stronger can be built in its place. But this is only the beginning. Jung noticed a strange pattern in the people he treated. The ones who suffered the most were often not the ones with the worst lives. They were the ones whose old way of living had simply stopped working. A career that once felt meaningful suddenly felt empty. A relationship that once felt safe suddenly felt suffocating. A personality that once felt like home suddenly felt like a costume that no longer fit. Jung had a name for this. He called it a crisis of individuation. It is the moment when the self you built to survive childhood, to please your parents, to fit into society, begins to crack under the weight of who you actually are. And here is the part almost no one tells you. That cracking is not a malfunction. It is the process working exactly as it should. Here's where almost everyone makes the same mistake. Think about the identity you built when you were young. You learned very quickly what earned love and what earned rejection. You learned which parts of yourself were acceptable to show and which parts needed to be hidden, so you built a mask. Jung called this the persona. It is not fake, exactly. It is a real part of you. But it is only a fragment, the socially approved fragment, and for years it can work perfectly well until it doesn't. At some point, usually in moments of loss, failure, illness, or deep exhaustion, the persona stops being enough. The performance becomes unbearable to keep up, and underneath it, something long buried starts to stir. Jung called this the shadow. What happens next changes everything. The shadow is everything you were taught to reject about yourself. Your anger, your desire, your grief, your ambition, your softness. All the parts that once felt dangerous to show, so you push them into the dark. But here is what Jung understood that most people never learn. The shadow does not disappear just because you ignore it. It waits. And when your usual coping mechanisms fail, when the persona can no longer hold everything together, the shadow rises to the surface, demanding to be seen. This is why so many people describe this phase using the same words. I don't recognize myself anymore. I feel like I'm losing my mind. I feel like I'm grieving someone who hasn't died. In a way, you are. You are grieving the version of yourself who no longer fits your life. And Jung would tell you that this grief, as unbearable as it feels, is not the enemy. It is the doorway. And what comes next is perhaps the most misunderstood part of all. But before you walk through that doorway, something else usually happens first. Something Jung considered one of the most misunderstood experiences in psychology. He called it ego death. Not in the dramatic, mystical sense people often imagine. In a quieter, more devastating way. It is the slow unraveling of who you thought you were. The plans you built your identity around no longer make sense. The beliefs that once gave you certainty no longer hold. Even your sense of "this is just who I am" starts to dissolve. This is terrifying because the ego is not just your personality. It is your sense of continuity. It is what tells you, moment to moment, that you are still you. When it begins to loosen, people often panic. They think something is deeply wrong with them. But Jung saw this differently. He believed the ego was never meant to be the whole of who you are. It was only ever the center of your conscious mind, a smaller structure inside a much larger psyche. And when life forces the ego to loosen its grip, it is not destroying you. It is making room. Room for the parts of yourself you exiled long ago. Room for a more complete version of who you actually are, beneath everything you were trained to be. Jung believed the next stage is where most people give up. This is why the hardest phase of your life so often comes with a strange and disorienting kind of isolation. People start pulling away. Conversations that used to feel effortless suddenly feel exhausting. Friendships that were built on your old identity begin to feel like they belong to someone else's life. This is one of the most painful parts of transformation, and almost no one prepares you for it. Jung believed that psychological growth is rarely a shared experience, at least not in its early stages. Individuation is, by definition, personal. It's about becoming who you specifically are. Separate from the expectations of your family, your culture, and even the people who love you. That kind of separation is lonely. But loneliness in this context is not always a wound. Sometimes it is simply the quiet required to hear yourself think for the first time in years. Stay with this because it explains something you have probably felt but never had words for. The people who drift away during this period were often connected to the old version of you. When that version starts to dissolve, so does the gravity holding certain relationships together. This does not mean you did something wrong. It means you are changing shape, and not everyone will be able to follow you into who you are becoming. Jung would say this isolation, uncomfortable as it is, often becomes the very space where transformation happens. Because it is only when the noise of other people's expectations fades that you can finally hear your own psyche speaking. And that voice usually shows up first as discomfort, before it ever shows up as clarity. But here's the part almost nobody expects. This is why so many people describe this era of their life as suffering without an obvious cause. Nothing catastrophic has necessarily happened, and yet everything feels unbearably heavy. Jung took suffering like this seriously, more seriously than most psychologists of his time. He did not see it as something to numb or bypass. He saw it as information. He believed that psychological suffering often arises not because something is wrong with you, but because something in you is being asked to change, and you are resisting the invitation. The tension you feel, the sense that your old life no longer fits, is not a flaw. It's the psyche pushing you toward growth you have been avoiding, sometimes for years. This reframes everything. The pain is not proof that your life is falling apart. It may be proof that an outdated version of you is falling away, so a more honest one can take its place. But letting go of that old version is rarely a single event. It happens gradually, often through a series of losses that feel unrelated at the time. A relationship ends, a career shifts. An old belief about yourself quietly stops being true. Jung believed that letting go is not simply the absence of something. It is an active psychological process, one that requires you to consciously release identities, expectations, and self-images that no longer serve your growth. This is difficult because human beings are wired for continuity. We crave a stable sense of self, but growth demands the opposite. It demands the willingness to be temporarily formless, to exist in the uncomfortable space between who you were and who you have not yet become. Here is where most people quit, right before the turn. This in-between space is where most people give up. It is disorienting. It offers no clear identity to hold on to, and so many retreat back into their old patterns, just to escape the discomfort of not knowing who they are anymore. But Jung believed this formless period is not empty. It is fertile. It is where the unconscious mind begins to reorganize itself, weaving together the fragments of your persona and your shadow into something more whole. This process, Jung believed, cannot be rushed. It happens in its own time, often invisibly, long before you can consciously see its results. This is why people often say that everything changed for them, seemingly overnight. In reality, the change had been building quietly for months, sometimes years, beneath the surface of their awareness. And this is where individuation reveals something almost no one talks about. Jung did not see individuation as becoming a better version of your old self. He saw it as becoming a more complete version of your actual self. Not the curated one, not the performative one, the whole one, shadow included. This means that the very things you have been running from, your anger, your ambition, your sensitivity, your fear, are not obstacles to your growth. They are raw material for it. Jung believed that true psychological maturity requires integration, not perfection. You do not defeat your shadow. You come to know it, understand it, and allow it to inform a more balanced version of who you are. This is why the hardest phase of your life often precedes the most meaningful chapter of it, because you cannot integrate what you refuse to face, and you cannot become whole while still performing a fragment of yourself. So if your life has felt unusually heavy, if old identities are dissolving, if people are drifting, if nothing feels certain anymore, this may not be the unraveling it feels like. It may be the quiet, invisible architecture of becoming who you were always meant to be. Jung believed that the psyche does not move in straight lines. It moves in spirals, revisiting old wounds with new understanding, circling closer and closer to wholeness with every difficult season you survive. This means the pain you are in right now is not separate from your growth. It is the mechanism of it. Somewhere on the other side of this collapse is not a return to who you used to be, but an arrival at someone you have never had the chance to become. Someone shaped by everything you are currently enduring. That is the quiet promise hidden inside the hardest chapters of life. They do not exist to destroy you. They exist to clear space for a self that finally makes sense. If this message found you at the right time, perhaps Carl Jung was right all along.